There were 6 of us without a guitar player, Cornelius Grant. I guess you heard about the limousine with the glasses.
He was the voice behind My Girl, but his own life was anything but sweet. David Ruffin had the talent to stand among the legends, yet the demons chasing him were louder than the cheers. From sleeping in abandoned buildings in Mississippi to standing under the blinding lights of sold-out arenas with the Temptations, his rise was iconic and his fall unforgettable. But here's the haunting question. Why is David Ruffin still one of the most underrated voices in soul history? Before the fame, before the bright suits and the Motown spotlight, he was simply a boy in Mississippi trying to survive. Born into hardship, raised in a house filled with both music and pain, David's earliest songs were carried on the air of rural churches, where faith was strong but comfort was scarce. His raspy, emotional voice, so powerful, so unexplainably mature for his age, could bring listeners to tears before they even knew the lyrics. And yet, that same boyhood was marked by loss, by poverty, by a father's harsh hand. By his teens, he was drifting, chasing gospel stages, carrying nothing but his voice and a dream. That dream burned with a single obsession, not to blend in but to stand out, to be remembered, to be the singer. Fame would answer him, but at a price greater than he could imagine. This is the David Ruffin story, brilliant, tragic, unforgettable. David Eli Ruffin's story begins in one of the most forgotten corners of America. On the 18th of January 1941, he was born in a speck of a town called Why Not, Mississippi. Even the name sounded like a place that was easy to overlook, and life there was as rough and remote as the dirt roads that stretched across the fields. David was the youngest of 4 children, arriving after his brothers Quincy B. Ruffin and Jimmy Lee Ruffin, and before his younger sister, Rita Mae. But before he could even form memories of her, tragedy marked his life. His mother, Oilia Ruffin, died when he was just a baby. Some say he was less than a year old. That kind of loss leaves an emptiness that lingers, shaping a child in ways he cannot yet name. Without his mother's warmth, David's world was ruled by his father, Eli Ruffin. Stories over the years mistakenly painted Eli as a preacher, but the truth was less glamorous and more grueling. Eli worked as a truck driver for lumber mills, putting in endless hours to scrape together a living. He was a hard man, shaped by hard times, and he passed that hardness on to his children. Relatives and neighbors later described him as harsh, even abusive, especially toward young David. Discipline came in the form of punishment that crossed the line into cruelty. In a house with little money, little comfort, and little peace, toughness was the only law. And yet, despite the severity of that upbringing, there was one source of light music. The Ruffins were a singing family. Church wasn't just a place of prayer. It was their stage, their refuge, their chance to feel alive. Gospel harmonies filled the small church halls, with David, his brothers, and sister all lending their voices. Even as a little boy, David's sound stood apart. His voice was raspy, raw, and startlingly emotional, as though it carried the weight of heartbreak far older than his years. People said he could make you cry before you even understood what the song was about. Music wasn't entertainment, it was salvation, a language to express what words alone could never reach. But childhood didn't last long for David. The walls of that small Mississippi home were filled with tension and struggle, and by the time he was barely a teenager, he had already seen more than most adults. Around the age of 13, he left home. Some say it was rebellion, others survival. Either way, he stepped into the world carrying little more than his voice and his determination. He began traveling with a gospel group known as the Dixie Nightingales. That decision pulled him out of Why Not and into a restless, wandering life. The road was not glamorous. David drifted from one southern town to another, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, singing wherever the gospel circuit would take him. Nights were often spent in abandoned buildings or on floors offered by strangers, and food was whatever he could find. He worked odd jobs just to make it to the next town. For a boy in his early teens, this was survival training as much as it was a musical education. Every church basement, every makeshift stage, became a place to sharpen his gift. During these years, whispers began to spread that he had crossed paths with some of gospel's greatest. Some claimed he spent time around Mahalia Jackson's people, perhaps learning from the aura of the most powerful gospel singer of her era. Others believed he opened for groups like the Staple Singers as a warm-up act, absorbing the electricity of audiences who lived and breathed sacred music. Whether every detail can be confirmed or not, what's undeniable is that David immersed himself in that world, soaking up the traditions, the phrasing, the way a singer could move an audience from tears to shouts within a single verse. But as the 1,950 seconds unfolded, gospel itself was shifting. Spiritual fervor was beginning to blend with the raw backbeat of rhythm and blues, and young artists felt the pull of something new. David was restless, too. By his mid-teens, he had lived through loss, through hunger, through nights alone in dark places, and he carried a hunger for something more than survival. The church stage was powerful, but he wanted a bigger stage, a stage where his voice wouldn't just echo through pews but through radios across America. That hunger eventually drew him northward, toward the city where opportunity pulsed in every club and studio, Detroit, Michigan. Detroit was becoming the epicenter of a sound that would later be called Motown, though in those early days it was just energy, just possibility. For David, the move wasn't only geographical, it was symbolic. He was leaving behind the scars of Mississippi poverty, the shadows of abuse, the echo of a mother lost too soon. He was chasing a dream that burned larger than anything life had handed him. By the time he arrived in Detroit, he was still just a teenager, but he had already lived a lifetime. He had felt what it was like to be abandoned, what it was like to lose, what it was like to fight for a place to sleep. And through it all, he had clung to music. That voice of his, sharp and tender all at once, had become his armor and his weapon. He was determined not to be overlooked, not to be forgotten in some corner of Mississippi. He wasn't trying to blend in. David Ruffin was built to stand out. And that drive, fueled by pain, by loss, by relentless hunger, would carry him from the dusty backroads of Why Not all the way to the polished stages of Motown. It was only the beginning of his story, but already the shape of his life was clear. Brilliance wrapped in struggle, a voice that could move mountains, and a man who would stop at nothing to make the world listen. When David Ruffin stepped into Detroit in the late 1,950 seconds, he was still barely more than a boy. Yet, behind that skinny frame and sharp face was a lifetime's worth of survival and an ambition that could not be hidden. Detroit wasn't just another city, it was the new center of black music in America, a place where gospel, doo-wop, and rhythm and blues collided in every nightclub and corner bar. For David, it was the perfect storm. Fate introduced him almost immediately to the Gordy family, whose name would soon become synonymous with Motown. Berry Gordy Jr. at the time was just a driven young songwriter with ideas bigger than his resources. His father, Berry Pops Gordy Sr., was a contractor, known in Detroit for construction work and for opening doors to those who needed a chance. Ruffin gravitated toward Pops, who not only gave him a roof but also put him to work. David moved into the Gordy household for a time, hammering nails, carrying bricks, and sweating through long days on West Grand Boulevard. The building they worked on together would one day be christened Hitsville, USA, the beating heart of Motown Records. Long before he ever sang for the label, Ruffin was literally helping build it brick by brick. But Detroit was more than just labor. It was a classroom, an informal conservatory where future legends absorbed lessons side by side. At Anna Records, a chess-distributed label founded by Berry's sister Gwen Gordy Fuqua and her partner Billy Davis, David found himself in the company of Marvin Gaye. The two young men were apprentices, eager, curious, and willing to do whatever it took to learn the ropes. Watching seasoned producers at work, studying arrangements, learning microphone technique, these experiences shaped them in ways no formal school ever could. Marvin Gaye would go on to become a Motown icon. David Ruffin was still waiting for his break, but he was in the right rooms. While networking and hustling around the Gordy circle, Ruffin also joined the Voice Masters, a Detroit vocal group that included another future giant, Lamont Dozier. Their sessions were a testing ground for David's blend of gospel power and raw street grit. His voice didn't sound like anyone else, it carried scars and soul in equal measure. He recorded early tracks like You Can Get What I Got in 1961 on the Checkmate label. The record didn't chart, but it didn't go unheard either. People noticed the voice. They just hadn't figured out where to place it. Those years were full of almosts. Ruffin sang backup for local groups, performed in clubs across Detroit, and even cut other solo singles like You and I'm in Love. None of them stuck. The city was crowded with talent, and standing out wasn't easy, even for a voice like his. Still, he stayed close to the Motown orbit. He was present in the studios, watching Smokey Robinson craft hooks, seeing how the Miracles built harmonies, noticing how the Supremes and Marvelettes worked the stage. He was a student of everything, biding his time, never losing sight of the stage he wanted for himself. What kept him going through the frustrations was the unshakable belief in his own destiny. Ruffin wasn't trying to be a background singer or a studio regular. He wanted to be the one whose name the audience shouted, the one whose voice played on radios nationwide. The determination that had driven him from Mississippi into abandoned buildings and gospel groups was the same fire that now kept him alive in Detroit's music scene. At the same time, his family ties in music reminded him that greatness was possible. His older brother, Jimmy Ruffin, was also chasing the dream and would later find success in his own right. For David, watching Jimmy make moves with Motown's Miracle records was motivation. It was proof that if you stayed close to the flame long enough, your spark could catch fire too. By the early 1960 seconds, Ruffin's persistence began to pay off in connections. He wasn't a star yet, but his circle was filled with rising names. He was close enough to Motown's magic to sense that something historic was happening, and he was determined to be part of it. He understood what most aspiring singers never did. Opportunity isn't just about talent, it's about being in the room when lightning strikes. And David Ruffin was positioning himself exactly where the storm was gathering. He had laid bricks for Hitsville, learned harmonies alongside Marvin Gaye, shared studios with Lamont Dozier, and stood quietly at the edge of greatness as the Motown sound began to define a generation. For many, those years would have been discouraging. For Ruffin, they were fuel. Each near miss, each overlooked single, only sharpened his hunger. He was already known around Detroit as the skinny kid with the unforgettable rasp, the singer who could make a song sound like a prayer one moment and a cry of heartbreak the next. All he needed was the right stage. That stage would soon arrive. The Temptations, Motown's young vocal group, were still searching for the missing piece that would transform them from potential into history. And David Ruffin, waiting, watching, burning for his chance, was about to step through the door that would finally swing wide open. The boy who once drifted through Mississippi with a gospel group, who once sang in church pews to escape his father's hand, was now on the verge of changing American music. Every hardship, every loss, every long night of doubt had led to this moment. The rise of David Ruffin was no longer a question of if, it was only a question of when. By 1963, David Ruffin had been circling greatness for years. He had sung in churches, cut small records, and built friendships in Motown's orbit, but superstardom still seemed just out of reach. At the same time, one of Motown's most promising groups was struggling to find its balance. The Temptations, already known around Detroit for their sharp harmonies and polished dance steps, had talent to spare, but lacked the spark that could push them over the top. The group had gone through transitions. They started as the Elgins before settling on the name that history would remember, the Temptations. They had the backing of Motown, they had producers in their corner, but commercial success continued to elude them. Behind the scenes, frustration grew. Audiences respected their professionalism, yet the breakout hit simply wasn't coming. Part of the problem was instability within the lineup. One of the original members, Elbridge Al Bryant, had become increasingly unreliable. He missed rehearsals, arrived late, and clashed with the rest of the group. Tension bubbled until one night it boiled over into a heated disagreement. Afterward, the group made a decision that would change everything. Al Bryant was out. Into that void stepped David Ruffin. He wasn't a stranger to the group. He had been hanging around rehearsals, lending his voice occasionally, and impressing everyone with his natural charisma. Tall, lean, and striking, David carried himself with a mixture of confidence and hunger. Most importantly, he had that voice. A tenor edged with gravel, brimming with soul, heavy with sorrow and power. It was unlike anything the Temptations had at that moment. Otis Williams, one of the founding members, later recalled the first time he truly heard Ruffin sing. He had that voice, man. You couldn't teach that. You couldn't fake that. For a group built on blending, here was someone who could cut through the harmony without effort, who could command attention without even trying. In early 1964, David Ruffin was officially brought into the fold, replacing Al Bryant and cementing what would later be called the classic lineup: David Ruffin, Otis Williams, Paul Williams, Melvin Franklin, and Eddie Kendricks. Together, they became 5 distinct voices woven into one perfect sound. At first, Ruffin didn't demand the spotlight. The Temptations had already established a formula, with Eddie Kendricks's sweet falsetto and Paul Williams's warm baritone handling most of the leads. David blended into the harmonies, adding texture, bringing a rawness that the group had been missing. But it didn't take long for producers to notice that his presence changed everything. In rehearsals, when he stepped to the mic, something shifted. His voice wasn't just strong, it was alive with emotion, carrying pain and passion in equal measure. He had the uncanny ability to make listeners feel as if he wasn't singing at them but with them, pulling them inside the song. That quality caught the attention of Motown's producers, especially Smokey Robinson, who began to see new possibilities for the Temptations. Within a year of joining, David Ruffin had gone from being the group's newest member to the man who would soon define its sound. His arrival was more than a lineup change. It was a turning point. For the Temptations, it meant the missing piece had finally clicked into place. For David Ruffin, it was the door he had been waiting his entire life to walk through. The stage was set. All the hardship of Mississippi, all the long nights in abandoned buildings, all the overlooked singles, every piece of his past had been leading to this. Now, with the Temptations behind him and Motown at his back, David Ruffin was ready to let the world hear what he had carried inside all along. And soon, that voice would give the group the hit they had been searching for. When Smokey Robinson walked into the studio in 1964 with a new song, he already had an idea of the voice he wanted to bring it to life. The song was deceptively simple, tender lyrics, a lilting melody, a warmth that could melt through static on any radio dial. But Smokey knew it needed more than sweetness. It needed power. It needed emotion. And when he looked at the Temptations, one voice stood out: David Ruffin's. Smokey later explained, "I wanted a voice that was strong, that had power and feeling. David had that." So he handed Ruffin the lead on a track called My Girl. The choice proved prophetic. Released in December 1964, My Girl was a slow burn at first, but by March 1965 it exploded to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the first chart-topping hit for the Temptations. Practically overnight, David Ruffin's raw tenor became the group's signature sound. His delivery on My Girl wasn't just technically perfect, it was unforgettable. He sang with a delicate balance of strength and vulnerability, making every listener feel like the words were meant for them alone. The success of My Girl changed everything. Suddenly, the Temptations weren't just another Motown act, they were superstars. And Ruffin was the face, the voice, the anchor of their success. Fans knew the other members, but when Ruffin stepped forward in his tailored suits and tinted glasses, the spotlight seemed to belong to him. The hits came one after another. Ain't Too Proud to Beg pulsed with urgency, his voice rising in desperation that sounded both gritty and real. Beauty Is Only Skin Deep captured a sincerity that struck listeners in the heart. On I Wish It Would Rain, his delivery carried such sorrow that fans swore they could feel the storm inside him. Then came I Know I'm Losing You, a track where Ruffin's voice sounded almost torn apart, raw with anguish and unforgettable in its intensity. Each song reinforced the same truth. David Ruffin wasn't just another lead singer. He was the Temptations' secret weapon, their emotional engine. He gave their catalog its edge, its heartbreak, its fire. His voice cut through arrangements like lightning through clouds, turning good songs into timeless anthems. Critics noticed. Fans noticed. Within Motown, whispers grew that Ruffin's presence had elevated the group beyond anything they could have reached without him. He wasn't just singing, he was embodying the music. He had the gift of making every performance feel like lived experience, as though the heartbreak was his own, as though the joy was his own. By the mid-1960 seconds, Ruffin's role had reshaped the identity of the Temptations. Eddie Kendricks's falsetto and Paul Williams's baritone remained vital, but the emotional punch, the sound that radio stations demanded, was Ruffin. His image adorned posters, his voice rang out in packed theaters, and his charisma captivated audiences. Yet with the spotlight came tension. Stardom was a heavy weight to carry, and David was beginning to feel its pull. For now, though, the story was one of triumph. After years of drifting, of chasing stages and hoping for a break, Ruffin had finally found his place. He was the man who turned the Temptations from a struggling group into Motown royalty. The success of My Girl and the string of hits that followed cemented Ruffin as one of the defining voices of soul music. But fame is never just applause and encores. For David Ruffin, the glow of success carried shadows that would soon stretch into his life and his group. Behind the #1 records and the screaming fans, cracks were beginning to show, cracks that fame, money, and even talent could not cover forever. Part 5, Amperes. Conflict, ego, demons, and the firing is approximately equal to 635 words. The meteoric rise of the Temptations in the mid-1960 seconds owed much to the unmistakable voice of David Ruffin. With My Girl and a string of follow-up hits, Ruffin became the group's de facto frontman. His name wasn't on the marquee, but audiences knew exactly who they were coming to hear, and that recognition began to change him. Almost overnight, the shy boy from Mississippi transformed into a Motown star. The spotlight magnified his presence, his tinted glasses, his sharp suits, his commanding posture. He was the face on the posters, the voice on the records, the man audiences screamed for. For Ruffin, it was intoxicating. For the rest of the group, it was the beginning of trouble. As the hits stacked up, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, Beauty is Only Skin Deep, I Wish It Would Rain, I Know I'm Losing You, Ruffin's deep emotional delivery became the hallmark of the Temptations. But with every ovation, his sense of self grew larger. He began to believe the group needed him more than he needed them. In his mind, it wasn't 5 equals anymore. He was the star. Ruffin began pushing for the group to be renamed David Ruffin and the Temptations, mirroring Diana Ross and the Supremes. To him, it was only fair. He was the one singing the hits, the one audiences demanded. But Motown had built the Temptations as a unit, a brotherhood without an official frontman. The idea of rebranding them around one man was a step Motown was unwilling to take. That rejection only fueled Ruffin's frustrations. Behind the scenes, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He started missing rehearsals, arriving late to shows, and making demands that set him apart from his bandmates. He insisted on his own limousine, his own spotlight, his own special treatment. What had once been camaraderie among brothers was now strained by Ruffin's ego and unpredictability. Adding fuel to the fire were the drugs. By the late 1960 seconds, Ruffin had developed a growing dependency on cocaine and painkillers. The substances amplified his volatility, making his moods more unpredictable and his absences more frequent. For a group whose success was built on precision, unity, and professionalism, Ruffin's spiraling behavior became impossible to ignore. Otis Williams, often the steady hand of the group, grew increasingly frustrated. He and the others had poured years of work into perfecting their harmonies and choreography, and now it was all at risk of being overshadowed by one man's chaos. Ruffin's demands for more money, more credit, and more control put him at odds not just with his bandmates but with Motown's management as well. Berry Gordy's label was notorious for keeping tight reins on its acts, and they were not about to let one temptation rise above the rest. By June 1968, the situation reached a breaking point. Ruffin had repeatedly missed shows, clashed with the group, and ignored rules. The brotherhood had eroded into resentment. The Temptations made the painful decision to fire him. It wasn't just a business move, it was the end of an era. But David Ruffin wasn't ready to let go. In the weeks following his dismissal, he would show up at Temptations, concerts uninvited, storm the stage, and grab the microphone. Audiences, still in love with his voice, erupted in cheers when he sang his old songs. For fans, it was thrilling. For the group, it was chaos. The message was clear. David Ruffin still had the crowd's heart, but he no longer had the group's trust. The Temptations moved forward with Dennis Edwards as Ruffin's replacement, continuing to chart hits and evolve. For Ruffin, however, the firing marked a dangerous turning point. He had the fame, the voice, and the fans, but now he was on his own. The very qualities that had elevated him to stardom, his ambition, his hunger, his refusal to blend in, were the same ones that left him isolated. His time with the Temptations had made him a legend. But his ego, his demons, and his self-destructive choices had torn that legend apart. The voice that had once united five men in harmony was now a solo cry, echoing down a far more unstable path. When David Ruffin walked away from the Temptations, many believed he was poised to soar even higher as a solo artist. His voice was still magnetic, his reputation undeniable, and his fans loyal. In 1969, Motown gave him the chance to prove himself. His debut solo album, My Whole World Ended, The Moment You Left Me, seemed like the perfect showcase for everything that had made him unforgettable. The title track was haunting and heartfelt, filled with the raw pain Ruffin delivered so naturally. It climbed to number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 2 on the R&B chart. For a moment, it felt like David Ruffin was unstoppable, but success proved fleeting. His follow-up album, Feelin' Good, 1969, offered strong material songs like I'm So Glad I Fell For You and I'm Just a Mortal Man, but without the same push from Motown, it barely made an impact. Rumors swirled that Berry Gordy and Motown executives had grown wary of Ruffin after his behavior with the Temptations. Whether true or not, the label's hesitation showed. Promotion was minimal, creative freedom was restricted, and his career momentum faltered. By 1970, he recorded an album simply titled David. It was intended as his third solo release, but Motown shelved it without explanation. The record would not see the light of day until 2004, long after Ruffin's death. The shelving was more than a missed opportunity. It was a crushing reminder of how quickly the industry could turn its back. Still, Ruffin pressed on. In 1973, he released the self-titled David Ruffin, which featured songs like Common Man and Blood Donors Needed, Give All You Can, tracks that revealed glimpses of his brilliance, even as commercial success slipped away. A year later, he tried again with Me and Rock and Roll Are Here to Stay, 1974, leaning into funk and rock influences, but Motown once again did little to promote it. By the late 1970s, the momentum he had once carried seemed all but gone. In 1977, Ruffin finally left Motown, hoping to rebuild his career elsewhere. He signed with Warner Brothers Records and released Gentleman Ruffin in 1980. The album had promise, with tracks like I Wanna Be With You, but it failed to spark a true comeback. The tragedy wasn't that Ruffin had lost his gift, his voice was still powerful. The tragedy was that everything else, management, marketing, his own self-destructive habits, stood in the way. Then, in 1982, hope flickered again. Motown organized a reunion between Ruffin, Eddie Kendricks, Dennis Edwards, and the Temptations. For fans, it was a dream come true. Night after night, Ruffin stepped out to sing My Girl, and audiences roared as if the clock had turned back. The reunion album, Reunion, included the Rick James penned single Standing on the Top, which reached number 6 on the R&B charts. For a brief moment, Ruffin seemed reborn. But history repeated itself. Behind the scenes, old tensions resurfaced. Ruffin's ongoing struggles with drug addiction made him unreliable. He missed rehearsals, skipped shows, and clashed with management. By 1983, the reunion was over. Still, Ruffin kept moving. In 1985, he and Eddie Kendricks teamed up once more, recording a duo album under RCA Records. Their chemistry remained strong, and they even shared the stage at Live Aid with Hall and Oates, delivering a powerful rendition of My Girl to a global audience. It was a reminder of what made Ruffin extraordinary, but consistency remained elusive. As the decade wore on, his addiction deepened. Cocaine haunted him, leading to arrests and even a short prison term in the late 1982. Promoters whispered about him with both reverence and fear. One famously remarked, "You never knew which David you were going to get, the genius or the ghost." By the early 1990s, David Ruffin was no longer the household name he once was, but he wasn't forgotten. He performed in small clubs, community festivals, and on throwback tours. In cities like Detroit and Philadelphia, and in pockets of Europe, he was still treated like royalty. But the crowds were smaller, the money thinner, and the man himself more fragile. On the 1st of June 1991, the story reached its tragic end. After reportedly taking crack cocaine at a row house in Philadelphia, Ruffin collapsed. A man dropped him off at a hospital under a false name and disappeared. David Ruffin was pronounced dead within hours. The official cause was an accidental overdose. He was just 50 years old. The world mourned. His funeral at New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit drew Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, Jesse Jackson, and countless Motown peers. Fans wept. Fellow artists paid tribute. But beneath the celebration of his talent was a heavy sadness. Everyone knew David Ruffin had so much more to give. Even after the lights dimmed and the headlines faded, David Ruffin's voice never disappeared. It was too singular, too powerful, too full of pain and fire to ever be silenced. From the very first note of My Girl to the aching cry of I Wish It Would Rain, his tenor carved a place in American music that time could never erase. Ruffin's gift was his ability to turn every song into lived experience. He didn't simply sing lyrics, he bled them. You could hear heartbreak in his phrasing, longing in his rasp, and defiance in every shouted line. He had a rare talent for making audiences feel as though he wasn't performing for them, but with them, carrying their own sorrows and joys in his voice. That quality set him apart not just among Motown singers, but in the history of soul itself. Recognition did come, though often too little, too late. In 1989, just 2 years before his death, David Ruffin was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the Temptations. Standing alongside the men he had once called brothers, he accepted the honor with grace. It was a moment that confirmed his place in history but also underscored the irony. For many fans, Ruffin's contributions deserved recognition beyond the group. His solo work, though overlooked in its time, carried artistry and emotion worthy of its own spotlight. That argument still lingers. Some insist that Ruffin should be honored twice, once with the Temptations, and again as a solo artist. His solo catalog may not have topped charts consistently, but it revealed the same raw power and unique phrasing that shaped Motown's golden era. Songs like My Whole World Ended, The Moment You Left Me, and his cover of Statue of a Fool showcased a man who could transform simple lyrics into unforgettable emotion. Artists across generations have echoed this sentiment. From D'Angelo to Alicia Keys, Bruno Mars to Maxwell, countless singers cite David Ruffin as an influence. His raspy, pleading delivery became a template for expressing vulnerability in soul and R&B. Even outside of R&B circles, legends like Mick Jagger publicly praised him, calling him one of the greatest soul singers he had ever heard. That cross-genre respect testifies to just how deep Ruffin's artistry ran. His voice also became part of cultural memory. My Girl remains one of the most recognizable songs of the 20th century, played at weddings, in films, and across radio stations worldwide. Every time someone sings along, Ruffin's presence is resurrected. Likewise, the urgency of Ain't Too Proud to Beg, or the aching sorrow of I Know I'm Losing You continues to resonate because of the depth he poured into them. Yet, alongside admiration, there is always a sense of injustice. Ruffin's story is remembered as much for what he achieved as for what he might have achieved. Addiction, ego, and industry neglect all contributed to his decline, but they do not diminish his impact. Instead, they make his legacy bittersweet, a reminder of how brilliance can be dimmed but never erased. The true measure of legacy is endurance. Decades after his passing, David Ruffin endures. His sound remains essential to any history of soul. His influence can be traced in modern R&B phrasing, in the way artists shape emotion, in the vulnerability that is now celebrated rather than hidden. He left behind not only classic recordings, but also a blueprint for how soul music could speak directly to the heart. He may have died young, his life cut short at just 50, but in music, David Ruffin remains immortal. The world may have called him troubled, difficult, even self-destructive. But history, through every replay of My Girl, through every tear shed over Statue of a Fool, calls him unforgettable. David Ruffin's life was a story of contrasts. He was the boy from Why Not, Mississippi, who grew up in poverty, loss, and hardship, yet rose to stand center stage as the voice of Motown's most beloved classics. He was the man whose tenor could electrify stadiums, yet who often found himself alone in silence, struggling with demons that fame could never heal. His career was a paradox of brilliance and pain. With the Temptations, his voice carried songs that defined a generation. My Girl, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, I Wish It Would Rain. As a solo artist, he revealed depths of vulnerability on tracks like My Whole World Ended and Statue of a Fool. Yet the recognition he craved so deeply often slipped through his hands, overshadowed by controversy, by addiction, and by the relentless churn of an industry that rarely forgives. And still, the music remains. Every time My Girl plays at a wedding or a family gathering, Ruffin's voice returns, as strong and timeless as ever. Every new artist who cites him as an influence keeps his legacy alive. He may have left this world too soon, but he never left the soundtrack of our lives. They called him troubled. They called him difficult. But above all, they called him unforgettable. David Ruffin reminds us that genius often carries a heavy price, but it also leaves behind a beauty that endures. His story is not just one of caution, it is one of resilience, brilliance, and a voice that will never be silenced.